Hello, and welcome back to the exploration of space. So far in this course, we've had an introduction to space exploration. We've learned about orbits and trajectories. We've discussed the harsh space environment, and we've studied how spacecraft and launch vehicles work. We're almost done with our course of study. You've gone through some difficult material and mastered some challenging concepts. Now we're going to add the human element by taking on manned space exploration. Some material isn't in your text, but we think you'll find it interesting and worthwhile. Although people have spent time in space since the early 1960s, we've only accumulated about 10 years or 1 decade in space. This is not a lot of time when you consider what we need to learn in order to go back to the moon and stay there, or go to Mars and create an outpost. The U.S. space program has had some incredible successes, as well as some tragic catastrophes. But through all the stunning achievements and heartbreaking failures, the dream of conquering space has always been primary. Here you can see the crew of the ill-fated Space Shuttle Challenger. People who are committed to space rarely have to ask themselves the question, why space? It's a feeling or a state of mind that fans the need to learn and explore everything about space. For you, the answer may be as simple as, because it's there and because we can. Okay, we're going to start with the history of the U.S. manned space program so we can be aware of how it all began. Notice the program name uses the older term manned, but we know how important men and women are to space exploration. The world was astounded when the Soviets launched the first man-made satellite, Sputnik, in 1957. It was a time of uncertainty in America and abroad. And in 1961, our new president, John F. Kennedy, proposed that the United States should take its place in the race for space. In his historic speech made to a joint session of Congress on May 25, 1961, President Kennedy said, "I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth." It's hard to say whether Kennedy was naive or just an optimist. But whatever the case, the U.S. space program quickly developed a wide range of technology with unprecedented benefits to humankind. We'll discuss several key projects that helped establish the U.S. as a leader in space technology. Between 1961 and 1975, the U.S. launched a number of crews on space flights. The U.S. space programs included Project Mercury, Project Gemini, Project Apollo, Project Skylab, and the Apollo-Soyuz joint mission with the Soviets. By 1961, the United States was ready to attempt human spaceflight. America's first crewed flights occurred under Project Mercury. 7 U.S. pilots were chosen as the original astronauts. In this photo, they are Scott Carpenter, Gordon Cooper, John Glenn, Gus Grissom, Wally Schirra, Alan Shepard, and Deke Slayton. Project Mercury included 19 robotic and 6 crewed flights, engaged the expertise of nearly 2 million mission people, and cost roughly $400 million. The amazing thing to note is the dates the 6 flights were accomplished on. The manned space program launched 6 flights from May 5, 1961 to May 1, 1963. In only 2 years, the U.S. was able to launch 6 manned flights. I bet if you asked any of the 2 million people involved in one way or another about these flights, they would all say that it was an incredible accomplishment. The astronauts were given ticker tape parades, gave endless interviews, and had their pictures on the covers of all major magazines and newspapers. They were real American heroes. The 6 astronauts who flew during the Apollo project were such extraordinary people that it's worthwhile to take a minute to review their careers separately. The first is Alan Shepard, who flew on the Freedom 7 vehicle in May 1961. Shepard was a rear admiral in the U.S. Navy. He deployed in the Pacific during World War II and became a pilot in 1947. He has the distinction of being the first American in space and the only Mercury astronaut to walk on the moon. The second astronaut was Virgil Gus Grissom, who flew on the Liberty Bell 7 vehicle in July 1961. Grissom was a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force, flew 100 combat missions in Korea, and entered test pilot school in 1956. Gus died tragically, along with Roger Chaffee and Ed White, in the Apollo 1 fire at Cape Kennedy in 1967. You can see his tombstone at Arlington National Cemetery. John Glenn was the third man in space and the first to orbit Earth, flying on the Friendship 7 in February 1962. He orbited Earth 3 times, logging in 4 hours and 55 minutes. Glenn was a Marine Corps fighter pilot who flew 122 combat missions during World War II. From 1975 through 1999, Glenn served as the senator from Ohio and at the age of 77 became the oldest man in space on board the Space Shuttle Discovery in 1998. Scott Carpenter flew on the Aurora 7 spacecraft in May 1962. He was the 4th man in space and the 2nd American to orbit Earth. As a U.S. naval officer, he flew reconnaissance missions during the Korean War. He has the unique distinction of being an astronaut and aquanaut. As an astronaut, he has flown in outer space, and as an aquanaut, he has stayed underwater for at least 24 consecutive hours. Wally Schirra flew on the Sigma 7 spacecraft in October 1962, becoming the 5th American in space. As a U.S. Navy pilot, he was loaned to the U.S. Air Force during the Korean War and earned the Distinguished Flying Cross. Schirra was the only man to fly on 3 American space programs: Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo. The photo on the right is Schirra with, in his words, one of the other astronauts who turns out to be Neil Armstrong, the first man on the moon. Gordon Cooper was launched into space in May 1963 aboard the last Mercury mission on the Faith 7 spacecraft. Cooper served as a test pilot starting in 1957, and he logged more time in space than all 5 previous Mercury astronauts combined. He also gained the distinction of becoming the first American astronaut to sleep, not only in orbit, but also on the launch pad during countdown. Now, that's one relaxed guy. The last of the original 7 astronauts was Deke Slayton. However, he was relieved of this assignment due to a heart condition. He became the director of flight crew operations, but was finally approved for flight in 1975 on the Apollo docking module. This mission marked the first historic meeting in space between American astronauts and Soviet cosmonauts. It's true that these men had distinguished and heroic careers, but they've been followed by a succession of equally impressive men and women, and given a few years, you could be one of them. Okay, let's get back to the spacecraft. Project Mercury's mission was to find out if a person could survive space travel and how space travel might affect the human body. The 6 flights proved the flight sequences were sound and that a pilot had a place in orbital flight. The astronauts couldn't maneuver the capsule as they would a plane, but they could direct it to its splashdown point. Here we can see a cutaway view of the Mercury capsule, which was very small but had just enough room for the crew member and all required equipment. The next spaceflight project for humans was Project Gemini. The objectives for Project Gemini were to improve methods needed for a lunar mission, put 2 people in space, rendezvous and dock with another spacecraft, and achieve the first walk in space. Here is a cutaway picture of the 2-person Gemini capsule. During Gemini's 10 flights, it also gathered additional information about how spaceflight affects the human body. By the time the missions were completed, the astronauts had the skills necessary to make a moon landing. Here you can see Project Gemini's objectives, which were all successfully achieved. After Gemini, the U.S. was ready to go where no one had gone before. The goals of Project Apollo were to establish technology that would meet other national interests in space, to land a man on the moon, to perform scientific exploration, and to develop man's ability to work on the moon. Apollo was a 3-part spacecraft. The command module, or CM, held the crew's quarters and flight control. The service module, or SM, was for the propulsion and spacecraft support systems. When the CM and SM are combined, they are called the CSM. And the last part is the lunar module, or LM, to take 2 of the crew to the lunar surface and return them to the CSM in lunar orbit. You can see a simple view of the CSM and the LM here. If you follow the news today, in NASA's quest to go back to the moon and beyond, they are using concepts that are similar to those used in Apollo. You may want to surf the web and look at some of NASA's current concepts. With Neil Armstrong's historic words, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," America realized Kennedy's goal of putting a man on the moon. Here you can see Neil Armstrong, the first man on the moon, Buzz Aldrin as he prepares to step on the moon, and the entire crew, including Michael Collins, who remained in the crew service module. After Apollo 11, 5 more flights reached the moon. A 6th, Apollo 13, didn't due to a spacecraft component explosion. But the Apollo 13 crew was brought back successfully to Earth by the skill, creativity, and dedication of the flight and ground crews. You should watch the movie Apollo 13 to get an idea of what was involved in saving the crew. Here you can see the crew of Apollo 13 and the spacecraft after it returned to Earth. We've just discussed the early manned space programs. Here is an interesting comparison of Alan Shepard in his spacesuit and Sunita Williams in her space shuttle flight suit. The space program has come a long way since its beginning in 1961 to STS-116 in 2006. In the next few slides, we'll do a whirlwind review of space activities by the Russians, Americans, and Chinese. We'll focus on areas in which key first-time events occurred. Many of the accomplishments we made in space were spurred on by the Russians. Early in the space race, the Russians took the lead by getting the first spacecraft, Sputnik, in orbit. And they also put the first dog in space, Laika, who you can see here. The Russians put the first man in space, Yuri Gagarin, in 1961, and were quite progressive by putting the first woman, Valentina Tereshkova, in space as well. Alexei Leonov accomplished the first spacewalk in 1965, and you should note that while the Americans were trying to put people on the moon, the Russians had over 60 unmanned flights to the moon. The Russians were and remain adept at putting cosmonauts in space and keeping them there for quite a long time. Between the time that Mir was first launched in 1986 to its re-entry in 2001, 28 long-duration cruise logged in 4,594 days. If you look at this slide, you can see the amazing progress Russia made with keeping people in space. The Mir was accessible to the international space community through numerous collaborations and eventually became known as Phase 1. Phase 2 is the International Space Station. This section has been about the U.S. manned space program, but we'll do a quick review of the robotic missions you learned in an earlier section. After the Russians launched Sputnik, we stepped up our efforts in space with some early attempts at launching spacecraft. The first, Vanguard, exploded on the pad, but shortly after this attempt, the Explorer 1 launched successfully. Here you can see the Explorer 1 model with JPL director Dr. Pickering, Dr. Van Allen, who discovered the Van Allen belts, and Dr. von Braun, who led the development of the Germans' V-2 rocket. Our early space program had both military and civilian implications, and the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, was formed in 1958 to organize our civil space efforts. NASA launched the first telecommunications satellite, Echo 1, which demonstrated our ability to reflect voice and picture signals through a large orbiting sphere. America's first space station was the single module Skylab. The objectives of Skylab were to prove people could live and work in space for extended periods and to expand our knowledge of solar astronomy beyond Earth-based observations. Since its launch in 1990, people continue to discuss the incredible discoveries of the Hubble Space Telescope. This large space-based observatory has revolutionized astronomy, by providing unprecedented deep and clear views of the universe. Launched and serviced multiple times by the Space Shuttle, Hubble has seen galaxies well over 12 billion light-years away. Many countries continue to operate in space. As you can see here, the Chinese have been active in space since 1970, and in 2003 they became the third nation in the world to have a complete crewed spaceflight capability. Here are views of the Shenzhou 5 manned spacecraft. Now we're at the activity part of our lesson. Answer the questions, and if you have any trouble, work with a classmate to find the answers. This clip introduces you to the beginning of our nation's manned space program. We'll see some footage of Apollo 11 and the astronauts who took man's first steps on the moon. Then we'll see some of the training that aspiring astronauts must go through in order to eventually blast into space.
This city of Houston, this state of Texas, this country of the United States was not built by those who waited and rested and wished to look behind them.
Liftoff. All right, liftoff, and the clock has started. Godspeed, John Glenn.
Sure, it looks like Houston down below us.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff. Liftoff on Apollo 11. It certainly looks like you're well on your way now. It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Good morning, Endeavour. Time to build the International Space Station.
We are ready.
It's my pleasure to present the 1998 class of astronauts.
I'm real excited about this group of people. They're a great group, very diverse background, and we can't wait to start bringing them into our organization and getting them to work helping us build the International Space Station.
In this video, we'll see key historical events that have led to the U.S.'s great achievements in space exploration. The footage of the Apollo 11 mission allows us to witness what it was like for astronauts setting foot on the surface of the moon. Additionally, we get to hear the actual conversation that took place between astronauts on the moon and Mission Control in Houston. Then we will see the launch of numerous Columbia, Discovery, and Challenger missions, including the first mission where a cosmonaut or a Russian astronaut flew on board a U.S. shuttle. Finally, we take a look at the future of space exploration, which includes the International Space Station, commercial spaceflight, and possibly the colonization of the moon.
Apollo 8, God bless all of you on this good earth. Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. And that may have been a small one for Neil, but that's a long one for me. Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here. Fundamental truth to our nature. Man must explore. And hopefully, he'll hit the ground at the same time. Boy, Houston, the beauty of this place is just absolutely incredible. Now it's plain, Apollo 16 is going to change your image. This has got to be one of the most proud moments of my life, I guarantee you. Columbia, Houston, we've got a super shot of the payload coming out. Hey, Toggle, we got it.
This is the first time we've let Charlie come upstairs.
Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Challenger now heading downrange.
They, the members of the Challenger crew, were pioneers. The Challenger crew was pulling us into the future, and we'll continue to follow.
Nevertheless, I want to assure you that this loss will not stop us as Americans from exploring the frontiers of science and the frontiers of space.
And liftoff. Americans return to space as Discovery clears the tower.
SPS 29 as Discovery clears the tower.
Atlantis begins another space voyage.
Liftoff on Columbia and its return to flight.
Atlantis and the Galileo spacecraft bound for Jupiter.
Space Shuttle Discovery for its Thanksgiving Day mission.
Booster ignition and liftoff of the maiden voyage of Endeavour on a satellite rescue mission.
Houston, Endeavour has a firm handshake with into a little telescope.
Just a few minutes away from the 18th voyage of discovery with the first flight of a Russian cosmonaut aboard the United States Space Shuttle.
We have ignition, and we have liftoff as America begins its journey back to the Red Planet.
Booster ignition and liftoff of Discovery with a crew of 6 astronaut heroes and 1 American legend.
This video illustrates many Russian accomplishments in space exploration. You will see the launch of Sputnik in 1957, followed by the first cosmonaut in space, Yuri Gagarin. Throughout this clip, we are fortunate enough to have access to actual footage of scientists and cosmonauts preparing for launch. We will see cosmonauts in training during simulated weightlessness and G-force exercises. And we will witness firsthand the development of onboard experiments that may one day save lives here on Earth. This 20-minute video is a concise and accurate account of Russian space history.
Знаете, каким он парнем был, тот, кто тропку звездную открыл. Пламень был и гром, замер космодром, и сказал негромко он сказал, поехали, он взмахнул рукой, словно вдоль по питерской, пронесся над землей. Словно вдоль по питерской, пронесся над землей. Первый путь по вселенной пролет, звездам мы вырвались, страх презрев, песни самых трудных дорог. Комсомольский дефолт опев, пылает небосвод зарей гагаринской весны, и продолжается полет в бессмертном подвиге страны. 100 веков стал героем народ, главный конструктор сказал, рискни и тот мятежный яростный взлет. Революции был сродни, пылает небосвод зарей гагаринской весны, и продолжается полет в бессмертном подвиге страны. Уже дни надежд и тревог, песни рассвета в сердцах у ног, запевала звездных дорог комсомолец небесных трав. Пылает небосвод зарей гагаринской весны, и продолжается полет в бессмертном подвиге страны. И продолжается полет в бессмертном подвиге страны. Звезды опять нам назначат свидание. Мы слышим разряды космических вьюг. Ты с нами идешь на задание.
Да, машина задрожала заметно. Поняли вас?
Зажигание.
Все хорошо у нас идет. Вас видим. Полет нормальный.
Земля в иллюминаторе, земля в иллюминаторе видна. Как сын грустит о матери, как сын грустит о матери, грустим мы о земле, она одна. А звезды тем не менее, а звезды тем не менее, чуть ближе, но все так же холодны. И как в часы затмения, и как в часы затмения, ждем света и земные видим сны. И снится нам не рокот космодрома, снится нам трава, трава у дома. Зеленая, зеленая трава. Путями неизведанными, прошит метеоритами простор. Оправдан риск и мужество, космическая музыка вплывает в деловой наш разговор. В какой-то дымке матовой земля в иллюминаторе, вечерняя ранняя заря. А сын грустит о матери, а сын грустит о матери, ждет сына мать, а сыновей земля. И снится нам не рокот космодрома, не эта ледяная синева, а снится нам трава, трава у дома, зеленая, зеленая трава.
For this lesson, we introduced the original 7 astronauts and gave a brief history of their careers. We learned the U.S. space program made some remarkable advances during the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo space programs. And we talked about the Russian and Chinese space programs briefly. Now we're going to look at the Space Shuttle, which has been NASA's workhorse for over 2 decades. Next, we're going to look at 2 case studies, the Space Shuttle and the International Space Station. Hundreds of astronauts and cosmonauts have ridden the Space Shuttle to and from orbit with many scientific, military, and commercial payloads. Most recently, the shuttle has helped deploy and build main parts of the International Space Station.